Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2008 biography by Michael Burlingame, Abraham Lincoln, A Life. Now, let's clarify this to start off. This is the two-part biography that was published that year, Volume 1 and Volume 2. This is not a review of the one-volume abridged version of this, which came out in 2023. It is also not a review of the completely unedited edition that you can view electronically through, I think it's through the Johns Hopkins University Press website, if memory serves. I could be wrong about that, but it is not a review of that. It is the review of the two-volume version, which is the version that for a while was the standard one. Michael Burlingame, one of the most well-known Lincoln scholars in the world, received his PhD from Johns Hopkins. That's where he studied, taught at Connecticut College for a number of years. And, you know, his focus throughout his entire kind of scholarship career has been on Lincoln. If you look at the citations and bibliographies of some of the Lincoln works that I've already reviewed on this channel, going back at least as far as the David Herbert Donald one in the mid-90s. Burlingame was cited as a major authority when Stephen Oates had his, plagiarism dispute. It was Burlingame who was kind of spearheading those allegations. He has been at it for a while, and he is someone who means business. Oates is not the only person he's thrown accusations at. He's someone who has spent time with the source material. He has spent time getting to know Lincoln. And, in the intro to these books, he makes it clear that he was not necessarily wanting to be the person to write this biography. He talks about how he could think of other people who were absolutely just as qualified and who he thought wanted to be that person, and then no one else really wanted to do it, so he eventually realized that, hey, if we want to have a decent multi-volume series on Lincoln, something that takes the perspective that Carl Sandburg tried to take but modernizes it with actual, accurate research in a lot of cases, Burlingame himself was going to have to be the person to do it. And so that's what we get, this two-volume, 2,000-page behemoth of a book. These two volumes that have been sitting on my desk for months, waiting for me to get to them, and I've finally gotten to them. This is the best biography of Lincoln you were going to read. There's no sense in me waiting to try to make that judgment. There's no sense in me trying to wait until the end to have you come to that conclusion to yourself. This is the best biography of Lincoln you will read. I still have others that I'm going to do reviews on for this channel, but I'm just telling you this right now. It's as good as it's going to get. So where to start? You have to start with the rigor, the historical rigor here. This book makes extensive use of primary sources. And one thing that Burlingame really tries to do in this narrative is really stick to primary sources while also acknowledging, the reminiscences of some figures, acknowledging them for what they are. There's a whole piece where he kind of talks about, how, on the one hand, reminiscences decades later are, in a lot of ways, not necessarily historically reliable, because, again, these are people trying to remember events from decades ago. They obviously are not going to have photographic memories of these sorts of things. It's very likely there are details that are going to be wrong. But the flip side is, these reminiscences may not be entirely accurate, but they add color to the story. And without some of these memories, you don't have much at all to go off of for Lincoln's early years, for instance. Like those reflections from people who lived with Lincoln, when people were asking them questions about it 40, 50 years down the line in some cases. These are the only things you have to really learn about his younger years when, he's living with people who are not especially literate. Obviously, he's not going to be literate for a lot of that time, or very super literate because he's a kid. But, that's where the information comes from. And I think Burlingame does a great job of acknowledging that, while also acknowledging that, yes, these are reminiscences, right? It's not that Lincoln was X, Y, or Z way. People remember him as being X, Y, or Z way. And the strength of this book, which is also why it's so unfathomably long, is how much Burlingame relies on these quotes, and how much Burlingame acknowledges these quotes for what they are by just putting them in the text, saying such and such person said this. Later on, this person said this. All these things that are utilized as supporting evidence for, claims that he's making, or in some cases, just using them to fill in color in the story. And it's amazing how deep he goes. I mean, there are figures here who they don't come close to being mentioned in other Lincoln biographical stories. Like some of Lincoln's best childhood friends are mentioned by name in this book. And I don't recall more than one or two of them ever coming up in the David Herbert Donald or the Ronald White or the Sandberg or whatever. There's so much ground being swept here. No stone being left unturned. And again, that's part of why this book is as massive as it is because Burlingame's not especially concerned about, cutting these pieces out to make a shorter narrative. Like, he is interested in the scholarly rigor of it all, saying, I'm going to back up my claim by talking about what these people said. Here's what they said. And there are moments here where it just, when he's making claims, especially about some of the more significant figures, maybe some of the more significant antagonists in Lincoln's life, you might say, where it's just kind of staggering what he's doing. For instance, a controversial one that I've talked about a couple of times in these reviews is Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife. People have had all sorts of different opinions on Mary Todd Lincoln, and there are people who have thought that she was, terrible in many ways, temperamental, egotistical, a compulsive spender, all sorts of things. And then there are people who are extremely sympathetic to her. People who think she was very misunderstood, that she was sort of defined by her trauma, and are very willing to look kindly and favorably on her. Burlingame's approach is basically, I understand why Mary Todd was the way she was, and here's all of the dozens and dozens of people who said that she was absolutely out of her mind. It's when I was first reading those pages in volume 1, which is kind of immediately after she and Lincoln marry, there's a lot of pages that talk about their domestic life. And just goes on and on and on. All these quotes from people telling stories about how horribly and miserably she treated Lincoln and that sort of thing. And there's so many of these different types of stories, so many distinct stories that it feels like, again, it's one of those things like where at some point you just have to realize that when there's smoke, there's fire, right? Like, after reading all that, I was like, well, I don't feel like I can reasonably give her the benefit of the doubt for not being as much of a difficulty or being as much of a stressor for Lincoln as she was, because like that's a lot of evidence that I've just been given that proves that entirely wrong. And I don't think it's malicious. Burlingame is not coming in here with agendas. He makes a lot of times saying, here is what a lot of people think that Mary Todd Lincoln probably suffered from. She was probably bipolar, probably suffered from massive depressive bouts. And there's also family history to prove it. He does a lot digging into kind of the family history with the Todds, also the family history with the Lincolns, when there were periods of time when Lincoln was depressive and even suicidal at one point. And he goes into talking about, hey, here are all these other people in the Lincoln family who were like institutionalized or suffered from crippling depression, and talking about how there's very much genetic factors at play that are out of anybody's control. That's no one's fault. But we're also not going to pretend like these things did not happen. And it comes up again in the second book, talking about kind of the White House dynamics and things. And it's a lot, but it's, again, it's done with rigor. It's not done to be a hit piece. The same is true for George McClellan, always an antagonist in all of these books. And granted, I don't think McClellan has quite gotten the benefit of the doubt in some of these narratives that maybe Mary Todd Lincoln has. But Burlingame makes a point of going after McClellan and saying, here are all the things that people said that he did, all the times that he refused meetings with Lincoln, all the quotes that he made in passing in conversations, things he brought up in letters, showing that, yeah, the guy was an egomaniac and was a nut. And it's just, again, it's moments like that where he's, again, not doing a hit piece. I come back to that, but he's making a point. He's saying, this is true. We don't have to like that this is true. We don't have to, be vitriolic, again, in the case of Mary Todd, but we have to accept that this is true at this point. Like, there's so much evidence saying that, yes, Mary Todd was a very difficult person to be around and a very difficult person to be married to. It's impossible to deny that. It's impossible to deny that McClellan was absolutely an egomaniac that made Lincoln's life that much worse. And, the flip side to that is I don't think Lincoln gets away scot-free, but I think Burlingame does ultimately, want you to come away understanding this is what he had to persevere through. This is what his life was like. These are all the things that happened to him. And this is how he rose through it. And this is how he built relationships with all these people who doubted him. This is how he convinced almost an entire damn country who had lost faith in him, even a year previously, prior to the end of the Civil War. So many people had lost faith in him, and how he just managed to turn that around by making the right decisions and trusting the right people and saying the right things at the right times and being there and seeing that and seeing the sort of reverence that people held for him after his death. It's compelling. It's well done. Now, is this a book that's dry and academic? I would say no. I think this is still, compared to other ones I've seen which are just so boring. If this book has an argument against it, it is the fact that the level of detail might seem academic in and of itself, but I don't think you lose any sort of narrative as a result of that. I just found myself engrossed in the details. It just built this world. It built this portrait of Lincoln even more for me. And I don't think Burlingame is that dense of just an actual writer. I just think he has a lot of examples that he shows to prove his point, as I've said. And from a pacing standpoint, as far as how it distributes its time, the first volume in this 2-volume set goes from beginning of his life through up to, I think, February of 1861, before he gets on the train to Washington. So it covers the Prairie years, the Illinois years, right up until he goes to D.C. Then the second volume is February 1861 through the end of his life. And I think, in that sense, I think that's a really great distribution because, again, especially with how long these books are, there's enough time where you really get to spend time with Lincoln, the child or the young, up and coming law student. You get to spend enough time with Lincoln, the congressman, Lincoln, the lawyer, Lincoln, the Senate candidate. You get to spend enough time with him in this era to help you fully appreciate just what he gets himself into, how he built himself up, how he built himself into this major figure. And as a result, again, what he got himself into after the fact. It's phenomenally done. And again, I've not read the condensed 1-volume version of this. I'm sure that a lot of what that volume excises is probably these ancillary quotes, right? These, I'm sure instead of 10 pages of quotes talking about how George McClellan was incompetent, it's probably reduced to 2, right? you're probably cutting out those stories. And I'm sure that even then a condensed version of this book would still be excellent, but as is the case with the best long works, I just have a hard time visioning it working as well as it does in that setting, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's no doubt that if we're talking about who has the most credentials to write a Lincoln book and who does the most effective job of doing research for this, I think he talks about this being like a 20-year long project or something. Like, there's no doubt Michael Burlingame takes those honors running away with it. And, you know, proves his merit too. He doesn't do 20 years of research for like a 500-page book. Like, the research shows, right? It's like if Robert Caro did his Lyndon Johnson series, you know, spent however many decades researching it and then just published all of his work in one set and said, okay, here you go. It's monumental. It's outstanding. And for as much as I think many of the other Lincoln bios I've read succeed in their own right, I think the Donald one and the White one are both excellent books and really good starting points. I don't know that this is a starting point, this Burlingame one. I don't think it's a starting point. It's a little bit too long for that. But holy cow, this is gold standard material. This is the type of thing where I think it's obvious that it's a gold standard even before you read it, but after you read it, you will understand why people talk this up. You will understand why people talk this up as maybe the best presidential biography or series of biographies that you will ever read. It's an outstanding mark of scholarship. It's an outstanding work of history. And it reinforces why, personally, I made the decision to jump into these Lincoln biographies in the first place, because I really wanted to understand the values of these different approaches, especially over time. And the depth of this one, with how it manages to still be accessible in spite of that, truly blew me away and made the whole endeavor worthwhile. Even if I hated everything else, this 2-volume series made it worth it. So, as kind of a conclusion, no, it's not your starting point for Lincoln. It really shouldn't be. But if you're familiar with his story, maybe you've read a couple of biographies, I don't think you can avoid taking this one in. Just really, I would really recommend trying to splurge a little bit for the 2-volume edition. I know it's kind of pricey, at least when I last saw it, it was a little bit on the pricier side. But I don't think you can miss the depth of this one. I worry you would miss too much if you did the 1-volume version. Phenomenal. It's 2,000 pages. It's a lot. It's closer to like 1,500 pages, I guess, because the bibliography is so massive, but all well worth it. I was surprised how quickly I finished these. And yeah, could not recommend these books enough if that wasn't very obviously clear going in. Michael Burlingame, Abraham Lincoln Alive, Volumes 1 and 2. Check it out. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep